Phantom in the Garden. The small riverside town of Willow's Edge was known for its picturesque views, with the river winding gently along the edge of the town and disappearing into the dense, ancient forest beyond. On misty mornings, the riverbank was shrouded in a ghostly veil, creating an atmosphere that was both serene and unsettling. Nestled within this ethereal setting was an old, abandoned garden, overgrown with ivy and wildflowers, its stone paths cracked and weathered by time. Few dared to venture near it, for the garden was said to be haunted by a ghost, a lost soul trapped between worlds. Peter, a young man of 25, had recently moved to Willow's Edge to escape the chaos of the city. He was drawn to the tranquility of the town, but more so to the mystery that surrounded the old garden. As a writer, Peter was always in search of inspiration, and the rumors of the haunted garden piqued his curiosity. He rented a small cottage near the river, within walking distance of the garden, and began his new life in the quiet town. Every evening, Peter would take long walks along the river, often finding himself standing at the entrance of the garden, staring at the iron gate that hung loosely on its hinges. The locals had warned him to stay away, whispering tales of the ghost that roamed the garden, a spirit of a woman who had died tragically many years ago. But Peter, ever the skeptic, dismissed these stories as mere folklore. He found the garden to be more enchanting than frightening, and began to make it a regular stop on his evening strolls. One particularly misty evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Peter decided to venture inside the garden. The air was thick with moisture, and the silence was almost deafening, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. As he pushed open the creaking gate, chill ran down his spine, but he shrugged it off and stepped inside. The garden was a maze of overgrown hedges and twisted vines, with statues of angels and mythical creatures half hidden among the foliage. A narrow path led deeper into the garden, where the mist seemed to grow thicker, swirling around his feet like a living entity. Peter followed the path, his footsteps echoing softly on the stone as he ventured further into the heart of the garden. As he walked, he felt a strange sensation, as though he were being watched. He paused, glancing around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step. It was then that he heard it, a soft, melodic humming, drifting through the mist. The sound was both beautiful and eerie, sending a shiver through him. It seemed to be coming from deeper within the garden, drawing him closer. Peter's heart began to race, a mix of fear and curiosity propelling him forward. The humming grew louder, more distinct, until he reached a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a solitary figure, a woman dressed in a flowing white gown, her long hair cascading down her back. She was standing by a stone bench, her back turned to him, her delicate hands resting on the weathered surface of the bench. "Hello?" Peter called out hesitantly, his voice trembling slightly. The woman turned slowly, and Peter felt his breath catch in his throat. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with large, sorrowful eyes that seemed to peer into his very soul. She was breathtakingly beautiful, yet there was something otherworldly about her, something that made Peter's blood run cold. "You shouldn't be here," the woman said softly, her voice carrying a note of sadness. I didn't mean to intrude," Peter stammered, taking a step back. I heard you, and..." The woman's expression softened, and she took a step closer to him. "No one comes here anymore," she said. "They're all too afraid. But you're different." Peter swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" "My name is Alara," she replied, her voice like a gentle breeze. "I've been here for a very long time. Waiting." "Waiting for what?" Peter asked, his fear slowly giving way to fascination. "For someone to remember me," she said, a wistful smile playing on her lips. "For someone to see me, to hear me." Peter's mind raced with questions, but he found himself unable to speak. There was something about Alara that captivated him, something that made him want to stay, despite the growing sense of dread that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. "You're a ghost," he finally managed to say, the words sounding strange in his own ears. "Yes," Alara replied, her gaze never leaving his. "I am what remains of a life that was cut short. A soul bound to this place, unable to move on." Peter felt a pang of sympathy for her. "How did you die?" Alara's eyes darkened and she looked away, her voice barely a whisper. "It was a long time ago. I was young, in love, but he betrayed me. In a fit of rage and despair, I ended my life here, in this very garden, and now I am trapped, doomed to wander this place for eternity." Peter felt a lump form in his throat. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Alara looked at him, her expression softening once more. "You have nothing to be sorry for. You didn't cause my pain." "But I can help you," Peter said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "I can help you move on." Alara shook her head slowly. "No one can help me. My fate is sealed." Peter refused to accept that. There had to be a way to free her, give her the peace she so desperately needed. He spent the next several days researching everything he could about spirits, hauntings, and ways to help them find peace. But the more he learned, the more he realized how difficult it would be to free Alara from her torment. Despite the odds, Peter continued to visit the garden every evening. He and Alara would talk for hours, sharing stories of their lives, their hopes, and their fears. The more time they spent together, more Peter found himself falling for her. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, kind, intelligent, and deeply passionate. But as much as he cared for her, he knew that their love was doomed from the start. As the days turned into weeks, the connection between them grew stronger, and so did the tension. Peter could sense that something was changing. The boundaries between their worlds were beginning to blur. Alara, too, seemed more distant, her presence growing weaker with each passing day. One evening, as the sun set and the garden was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, Peter found Alara sitting on the stone bench, her form more transparent than usual. She looked at him with a sorrowful expression, and he knew that their time together was coming to an end. "I can't stay much longer," Alara said, her voice barely audible. "Why?" Peter asked, his heart breaking at the thought of losing her. "Our worlds are not meant to collide," she replied. "I am bound to this place, to the memories that haunt it. But you are alive, and you must go on living." "I don't want to leave you," Peter said, his voice choked with emotion. "I love you, Alara." A tear slipped down Alara's cheek as she reached out to touch his face, her hand passing through him like a whisper of wind. "I love you too, Peter, but our love cannot last. I am a ghost, a shadow of the past, and you are the future. You have to let me go." Peter shook his head, refusing to accept her words. "There has to be a way. I'll find it. Alara placed a finger to his lips, silencing him. "No, Peter, you've already given me more than I could have ever hoped for. You've seen me, heard me, and made me feel alive again. But now, it's time for me to rest." Tears streamed down Peter's face as he nodded, knowing deep down that she was right. "I'll never forget you, Alara." "And I will never forget you," she whispered, her form flickering like a dying flame. "But you must go now, for it's too late." With a heavy heart, Peter stood up and took one last look at the woman he had come to love, knowing that this would be the last time he would ever see her. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the silent garden as the mist closed in around him. As he reached the gate, paused and looked back, but Alara was gone. The garden was empty, save for the faint scent of wildflowers that lingered in the air. Peter closed the gate behind him and walked home, the weight of loss heavy on his shoulders. In the days that followed, Peter found it difficult to return to his usual routine. He missed Alara terribly, her absence a constant ache in his heart. But he knew that she was finally at peace, and that was what mattered most. One evening, as he sat by the river, watching the sun set over the water, he felt a gentle breeze brush against his cheek. It was then that he knew Alara was still with him, not in body, but in spirit. She would always be a part of him, a memory that would never fade. Peter smiled as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. The soft, cool breeze carried with it a whisper. A memory of Alara gently caressed his face. Peter knew deep down that she was still with him, not in the physical sense, but in the echoes of their shared moments, in the garden that held both their secrets and sorrows. Days turned into weeks, and though the pain of loss still lingered, Peter slowly began to heal. He threw himself into his writing, using the story of Alara as the foundation for his next novel. Every word, every sentence was filled with the emotions he had felt. Love, fear, the sorrow. The story of the ghost in the garden became more than just a tale. It was his way of keeping her alive, of ensuring that her memory would never be forgotten. As he wrote, he often found himself returning to the garden, standing at the gate, peering into the mist, still clung to the ancient trees and wildflowers. He never went inside again, respecting the boundary that had been set between their world. Instead, he would linger at the gate, speaking to the air as if Alara could hear him, telling her of his progress, of his life, of how much he missed her. The town of Willow's Edge, too, seemed to change in subtle ways. The whispers of the ghost in the garden grew quieter, and the townspeople who had once feared the place began to forget its eerie reputation. The garden itself, though still overgrown and wild, seemed to take on a more peaceful aura, as if the spirit that had haunted it finally found rest. Peter's novel, titled The Phantom in the Garden, was published to critical acclaim. Readers were captivated by the story of a love that transcended life and death, of a young man and a ghost who found each other in a world where they did not belong. It wasn't long before the book became a bestseller, touching the hearts of many who read it. Peter, however, cared little for the fame or the praise. What mattered most to him was that Alara's story was out there, that she was remembered, and that in some small way she had found the peace she deserved. Yet, even with the success of his book, there were nights when Peter would wake from a dream, his heart aching with the memory of Alara. In those dreams, he would see her standing in the garden, smiling at him, her form as ethereal and beautiful as it had been the first time he saw her. She would reach out to him, her touch as light as a whisper. And for a moment, it felt as though they could be together again. But as always, the dream would fade, and Peter would wake up alone in his bed, the reality of their separation settling back in.
It was a bittersweet existence, but one that he had come to accept. He knew that their love, as powerful as it was, could never have lasted. They were from different worlds, and though their paths had crossed for a brief time, they were never meant to stay together. Years passed, and Peter grew older, his hair turning gray, his face lined with the passage of time. He never married, never found another love like the one he had with Alara. The garden, too, continued to age, its stone statues crumbling, the wildflowers growing ever more rampant. But even as the world changed around him, the memory of Alara remained as vivid as ever. On the day of his final breath, Peter found himself back at the garden gate, his body frail and weak, his breath shallow. He knew that his time had come, and there was no place he would rather be than here, at the place where he had found and lost the love of his life. As he stood there, the mist began to swirl around him, thickening into a familiar, comforting presence. And then, through the haze, he saw her, Alara, as beautiful and radiant as she had been all those years ago. She was waiting for him, her hand outstretched, her eyes filled with the love that had never faded. "Peter," she whispered, her voice as soft as the breeze that rustled the leaves. "I've been waiting for you." Tears filled his eyes as he reached out to her, his heart swelling with a joy he had not felt in years. "Alara," he whispered back, his voice trembling. "I've missed you so much. Come with me," she said, her smile gentle and inviting. "It's time to go home." Without hesitation, Peter stepped forward, taking her hand in his. As their fingers intertwined, he felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of peace that he had never known in life. The mist around them began to glow with a soft, ethereal light, and the world of the living slowly faded away. Together, they walked through the garden, their steps light and effortless, as if they were floating. The stone statues and wildflowers blurred into a kaleidoscope of colors, the boundaries of the garden dissolving into nothingness. All that remained was the two of them, hand in hand, moving toward a light that grew brighter and brighter with each step. Peter knew that he was leaving the world he had known behind, but he felt no fear, no sadness. All that mattered was that he was with Alara, that they were finally free to be together, without the barriers of life and death to keep them apart. As they reached the light, Peter looked at Alara one last time, his heart overflowing with love. She smiled at him, her eyes shining with the same emotion, and in that moment, he knew that they were home, that they would never be separated again. And so they stepped into the light, leaving behind the world of the living, their souls entwined for eternity. In Willow's Edge, the old garden slowly fell into ruin, forgotten by time and by the people who once feared it. The stories of the ghost and the young man who loved her faded into legend and eventually into nothing. But somewhere in a place beyond the reach of time, Peter and Alara remained together forever.